Welcome to our EV Charging in Apartments Buildings webinar. I'm going to be your moderator today. My name's Anthony Weinberg and I'm the Regional Environmental Program Manager. The webinar is hosted by 6 councils: Mosman, North Sydney, Randwick, Waverley, Willoughby and Woollahra. You'll see on your screen the agenda for today. We, as a group of councils, are very interested in electric vehicles, and we hope the webinar provides you with some useful information on how to best manage the installation of electric vehicles in your apartment buildings. As EV adoption becomes more widespread and increased numbers of EVs appear in your apartment buildings, we think this will become a useful information resource for you. As councils, we're interested in the EV transition, as we have a large proportion of our populations living in apartments, and our council areas are projected to be EV hotspots into the future. I'm just going to introduce a few of our guest speakers. We have Brent Clark from WattBlock with us, Tim Washington, the CEO of JetCharge, and Mark Melocco, who's an EV owner and Strata resident. There's going to be some polling that pops up, and would like you to participate in the pre-polling and to get your feedback. And that includes a participant survey at the end of the webinar. The first pre-poll should pop up now, and you should be able to answer it. Just wanted to run through a few quick housekeeping things. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the video and slides will be distributed in a follow-up email afterwards. During the webinar, you'll be able to view both the speaker and the presenter in a split screen format. And today's webinar will be recorded and the video will be distributed afterwards to registered attendees. If you're after any further information about anything you've heard today, or you'd like to make contact with any of the speakers or their companies, the contact details will be made available and distributed in a follow-up email. In addition, we'll have a 3 to 5 minute summary video produced and issued through the webinar and made where possible on councils' websites. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have by pressing the raised blue hand on your webinar, and we'll allow some time throughout the presentations and the end to get through as many as we can, but apologies once again if we don't get through all of the questions. So which brings us to our first speaker for the day. So I'd like to introduce Brent Clark, who is the CEO and founder of energy consultancy WattBlock. Over the past 5 years, Brent has assisted apartment buildings housing over 50,000 residents with energy efficiency, renewable energy, and electric vehicle charging. Welcome, Brent. And to kick off, can you tell us a bit more about the work you've been doing with WattBlock to demystify EV charging in apartments?
Sure, Anthony, and thanks for inviting us along today. It's going to be a great session. So, at WattBlock, we've been running electric vehicle surveys just like this for apartment buildings, and we've run them for about 140 different apartment blocks from Melbourne to Cairns. And we've got some fascinating facts which we're going to go through the course of this webinar. So originally, we had a project with City of Sydney funding, and it was conducted in association with some partners, Tesla and AGL. And the scope of this project was to try and work out the best way to get residential strata schemes, apartment blocks, prepared and road mapping their future for charging electric vehicles. And we had a phenomenal response with over 80 apartment buildings from the City of Sydney registering their interest in the project. We conducted surveys with over 700 individuals, and we went out for deep dives and got our hands dirty in 20 of those apartment blocks. These are some of the participating strata schemes. And as you can see, definitely a lot of premium buildings here, some high rise. Keep in mind, this was prior to the introduction of the more cost-effective EVs that have been coming into the market in the last couple of months. Now, some key findings. Okay, this is strata, and nobody likes anyone to get anything for free. So we found that 79% of people wanted a user pays charging system inside their apartment block, whoever was charging an electric vehicle. Now, the stat that really interested us was 78% of people were in favour of installing charging systems right now. And when it came to where should we put these charging systems, should they be in a visitor car parking spot or in an individual car owner's lot, 61% expressed their preference for charging in their own car parking space. Now, only 11% of people knew the location of the nearest public charging station, but with the great work that the Tri-Councils are doing, we're sure that that figure is going to increase very rapidly. So some key considerations for strata going down the path of installing electric vehicle charging. Well, one of the things that we came across was the age and compliance of existing main switchboards. There are a lot of analogue meters out there, ceramic fuses, and would we say wooden backboard switchboards in the older blocks. Now, these are no longer compliant to AS3000 standard. Obviously, everyone's heard of the capacity limitations for charging electric vehicles, but more important was the actual distribution board and the capacity of that that's located closest to the car park area. And when it came to looking at those distribution boards, there are obviously some limitations just in the number of free slots. These distribution boards are used for air conditioning, car park lighting, ventilation, etc. Another challenge is the physical separation of the car space where an owner wants to charge from the nearest distribution board, and the existence or non-existence of cable trays throughout the car park areas. And Tim will talk more about this later. Now, the user pays considerations are absolutely paramount in strata. And early on, we were looking at, can a user charge off their own electricity meter, or can they be submetered off the common area meter? And there are a lot of advantages to going down the latter path and having the user submetered off the common area as opposed to allowing them to connect to their own apartment meters. Now, the next area that created a lot of contention was the visitor car parking charging versus charging in the individual car spaces of the lot owners. Well, we found something else that really you should check with your local council. And in some areas where it might be leviable parking, installing a electric vehicle charge station in a visitor car parking spot can be considered a change of use, and it may even trigger a state land tax. And finally, bylaws. So this is strata, and we've gone through many iterations of these bylaws now. Bylaws for charging in individual lot owner spaces, bylaws for charging in visitor car parking spaces, end use agreements where you estimate the amount of electricity that's going to be consumed for the year and maybe pay that in advance to your strata committee, more advanced payment solutions, and charging speed. You know, in the interests of the collective good in an apartment building, can someone who's just purchased a brand new Tesla be convinced to install a 16 amp charger and leave capacity for the future electric vehicle owners that are coming into the building? And the bylaws also have to cover things such as not only the upfront installation, but if that person sells their apartment, uninstallation of the charge station, or if it can't be uninstalled, some strata schemes, the owner's corporation is going to take ownership of the charge station after the lot owner sells. So we've got a couple of pictures. Here you can see visitor parking is particularly scarce in the CBDs of Australian cities. And also, it's policed. there are too many instances in Strata of people hogging the visitor car parking spots. And EV charging is just one more thing that adds contention. Now, this is a very interesting photo. There's a couple of things going on here. This is unbilled charging of a hybrid EV. Perhaps we'll see a trip hazard with an extension lead running across the main driveway where other cars are driving in and out of the basement car park. And also a danger here. This particular basement car park has a history of being flooded. So this is absolutely not the ideal form of charging in our apartment blocks. We mentioned earlier some switchboards needing to be upgraded. Let's say not much love and care has been given to these switchboards in our strata buildings over the past 30, 40 years. Analog meters, and at some point these old buildings may even have to get a new grid link and expand the capacity from the local substation. Now, what could be possible is electric vehicle charging in car share spaces in strata. And here's an example of a strata scheme from Erskineville with a couple of car share spots inside it. Now, we've got some analytics here from Wattblock's Ross McIntyre. And what we've done is we've shown the load of the common areas of an apartment building, which is in grey at the bottom, and then going through 24 hours, starting from midnight and going to midnight, we can see the impact in a theoretical building where every owner had an electric vehicle charging system, but they were using a smart charging system, one that's load balanced and networked and coordinated. Now, the analytics on the next slide is the same building, except we'll show you what would happen with unmanaged charging without that power management capability. Here you can see peak demand problems. And as we know, in residential strata, peak demand, capacity charges are some of the things that have been driving up our energy bills. So hopefully this has given a good intro into what we've discovered in our journey through these 140 apartment blocks, who are some of the first movers to get ready for electric vehicle charging. And I'm now going to hand over to Tim, and he's going to take us a little bit deeper.
Thanks, Brett. Just before we get Tim talking us through the different charging levels, we had a few questions coming in. Brett, I loved your photos of the car that is taking the power from that GPO. I can see you've spent a lot of time in basements of apartments, which is, I'm sure you've seen a lot of interesting things. But I wonder if you can tell us what's been the feedback on you using the common property and, more importantly, the visitors' car park as the designated EV charging spot. I guess it has some initial advantages, but some disadvantages.
Yeah, look, the visitor car parking spot, we've got a perfect scenario. Out in the suburbs where visitor parking is abundant, there's a strata block that's got 12 owners, 12 units, and they've got like 16 visitor car parking spots outside. And the easiest thing for them to do was just put a charge station in one of those visitor car parking spots, and because they never reach capacity in their visitor car parking, that's a perfect solution. Probably about 39% of the respondents to the survey are open to this type of arrangement, but we'd have to say that it's a bit of a stopgap measure. It's basically something for the short term, and everyone's looking for an inflection point. Maybe when they get 5 or 6 electric vehicles in their apartment building, it's definitely not something that we would consider as a long-term roadmap for the building.
No, that's really interesting. I think we've had a few questions along the same lines of people coming in, charging their cars, going up and having dinner, and then a few glasses of wine later, they're not coming back down to move their car.
Yeah,
so.
we tried a bylaw that limited people charging at 4 hours, and they had to move their car.
Right.
And
was it successful?
It didn't work.
No.
So.
That makes sense. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm going to hand over now to Tim Washington. So Tim is the founder and CEO of JetCharge, Australia's largest EV infrastructure specialist. He's also the co-founder and director of ChargeFox, Australia's largest EV charging network. And ChargeFox is one of the organisations building Australia's first ultra-rapid charging network. On the industry front, Tim is the chairperson of the Australian EV Council, the peak body for EV industry in Australia. So welcome, Tim. I just had a quick question that had come into my mind, which is, how often do you get apartment owners or strata committee members contacting you about EV charging?
So at the moment, Anthony, we're probably seeing around about 3 to 4 a day, which actually, is probably a surprise to some people. But I can tell you interest is absolutely enormous right now, especially with the new bevy of EVs that are coming onto the market. But look, I've been given 10 minutes to distill 6 years worth of experience, so we'll just see how we go. If you take nothing else from the presentation today, just know that it is possible to charge an electric car in your apartment. So regardless of what you read, regardless of what your owner's corp says, it is possible to charge an electric car in, I would say, 99% of buildings. And today I'm going to show you a little bit about how you go about doing that. So who are we? This is a slide that basically talks about how good we are. Essentially, we help people transition to a low emissions transport economy, including residents in apartment buildings. Perhaps more relevantly, we're the charging partner for 11 vehicle brands nationwide, which basically means that when you buy an electric car, we'll probably be the first people you call to install a charging station. Okay, so this is a pretty complicated slide full of plugs, but the point I want to get across now is that we have a single approach to electric vehicle charging in this country from a plug standards perspective. So you no longer have to worry about what plugs are compatible with what cars. When you go to an EV charging infrastructure business, they will be able to recommend a plug that is universal to all of the vehicles. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Then you'll hear about levels of charging. And I don't know what engineer came up with all of these levels and modes, and who cares, right? You just want to charge your car. So what I've really spaced out here is that it goes all the way from a power point, which is on the left-hand side, it's a portable charger, to the really, really fast charging stations that we're installing on highways. Now, most of the time, you will be installing a charging station in your own car space. That's what we call level 2 or AC charging. So that's on the left-hand side, so it's a little unit. And then we talked a little bit about visitor parking before. That's on the right-hand side. We are now starting to install what we call DC charging in visitor car parks. So what does that mean? It means you'll be able to get a full charge in under an hour. So instead of kind of waiting around for 4 hours, you just have to basically charge for an hour, maybe a week, and then you'll be able to get a 400 kilometres, say, and then you can move your car. So where we are installing charging stations in visitor car parks, we are now starting to install DC charging stations, which is far better. Okay. For those of you who have not seen charging stations in apartments, this is what it looks like. On the left-hand side, we have an earlier kind of one that we put in for a few residents, and on the right-hand side, you've got one that is just essentially in a car park. They are unobtrusive. They are small. They are not offensive. And best of all, if you move, you can just take them off the wall. And then the good thing is that you've got the circuit run for the next person who moves in and might have a charging station. Now, when we get approached by an apartment owner or by an owners committee or a strata manager, we always ask them, what are you trying to achieve? So what we've done is we've come up with a series of graphics that I'll run through with you today about kind of the questions that you're trying to answer. And we've broken up into a few things. So the first is some people just say, look, I just want to offer the first few people the capability of charging their EV without really doing any works, right? And so this is the first one. I want to give the first few, get a precedent in there, show people that EVs are a real thing and they're not from some fantasy land. They're not only for hippies. You know, you see that people actually will charge them. So what we do is we utilize existing public light and power distribution boards to run the EV chargers. Most of these boards will have capacity for between 3 to 5 electric vehicles straight off the bat with no modification. And that's because we don't install at the full 3-phase maximum capacity charge rate that some cars can take. We only install on single phase, and we make sure that we don't, overload the distribution board. So this can be done. It's paid for by the owner, and the charging station gets installed in their own car space. Then we go to the next bit. The strata manager comes to us and says, I want to expand my EV charging capability, but I don't really want to upgrade the cabling. I don't want new distribution boards. I don't want to run new circuits from the main switchboard. What happens then is we do exactly the same thing, but we install what's called an energy management system or a load management system. So what does that do? It measures the amount of electricity that's going through that distribution board, and it dynamically, so on a live basis, alters the charge rate of the charging stations so that it doesn't exceed the capacity of that distribution board. So imagine a situation where, everyone's coming and going to work, the lifts are on, the lights are on, all of that's going on. You're using a bit more power, right? But when everyone goes to sleep, 2 of the lifts have gone down, the aircons aren't really on, the lights aren't on, you have more power, so we can ramp everyone's charge rate up. By doing this, we can still use the same distribution board, but we can provide up to 5 times as many cars the capacity to charge. And so we think that's a pretty good interim solution. Then you say, I want to future-proof my building, but I want to do it for this one car park level at a time. What happens then is slightly more complicated. We run a new distribution board from your main switchboard. And then this is what it looks like. This is kind of like the end game, if you like. So if you want to offer EV charging to all of your residents, it is possible. What we do is we essentially look at your whole of building infrastructure, and we may need to upgrade your main switchboard. We may need to upgrade your consumer mains, or we may not need to do any of that, and we just run a new distribution board for electric vehicles, put our load management system on basically all of the levels, and we handle an entire building. We're starting to see the first few of these come onto our books where existing buildings, have come to us and said, look, we want to future-proof our entire building. And the reason they're doing that is because there's a new building that's been built next door, and the developers, because it's a new building, have had the ability to plan for it. And in these new developments, we're installing 50, 60, 70 charging stations. So in a market where there's an abundance of properties available, but not that many properties capable of EV charging, we're starting to see wealthy EV drivers moving into apartments that have a capability to charge their cars, and the existing buildings don't want to miss out on that. So we're starting to see a few of those roll through. This is just an explanation on how the load management works. As I said before, as the loads get more, as the load of the building dies down, we get to charge more cars. And we cycle people through when they come home. This is a really interesting fact from our ChargeFox network. We manage over 1,000 plugs in Australia. And the one misconception we always see is that people think that you charge from empty to full. So this is real data. And what this is telling you is that for the vast majority of people, you charge less than 10 kilowatt hours, in fact, less than 5 kilowatt hours per charging session. 5 kilowatt hours is almost exactly 35 to 40 kilometres, which also happens to be the average daily drive of an Australian commuter. So what we see from this graph is that people are actually just plugging in every day to cover off on their daily drive. They're not charging from empty to full. So what does that mean? It means that you don't need to install really high capacity EV charging. You can install slightly slower charging, but help more of your residents charge. And the challenge is not, can we charge everyone in the building overnight? Because we can. The challenge is, how do we stop everyone from charging at once in a world where everyone is driving EVs? And to do that, what you need is a hardware agnostic, so a charging station agnostic energy management system to do exactly what Brent was talking about before, manage the peak load. And you can do that now. Now, what do you do about billing? So I'll just run through this very quickly. We believe that you need to have a scalable, modern billing solution. So the stations that we roll out, every session is metered. Every session is monitored. And then we reimburse the owner's corporation per charging station, so per EV owner. It is then up to ChargeFox to collect that money from the EV driver. That way, the owner's corporation has no hassle, zero admin, and they get exactly the amount of electricity that they've given to the EV driver. So all of that is possible. You can just ask us how to do that. So that's pretty much it, and thanks for your time. I guess I'll reiterate that if you're thinking about buying an electric car and you live in an apartment or you're a strata manager who wants to improve their property values, it is absolutely possible right now to install the necessary infrastructure to make all of those things happen. Cool.
Very good. Thank you, Tim. That was excellent information and some very good graphics for our listeners. I'll just remind everyone out there, everyone is feel free to ask any questions. The way you do that of anyone on the audience is by pushing the raised blue hand on the webinar, and a message will come through to us and we'll be able to ask that for you. Tim, a couple of questions have come through already for you.
Great.
And the first one is, does current EV charging tech provide for charging of e-bikes? So you can charge an EV or e-bike at one plug. Not many people want an EV, but some just have e-bikes.
So the charging stations that we sell can't charge e-bikes, unfortunately. Most e-bikes, as far as I'm aware, charge from a power point. Mm-hmm. There are metering solutions for power points. Mm-hmm. And so if anybody has questions around that, they can ask us too. We just don't sell it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And another question, this is from Jack.
Mm-hmm.
He has an old block with basic wiring, and what would be the estimated cost to install an EV charging system for a 12-unit block?
Wow.
How long is an EV cable?
How long is a piece of string question?
Look, at the end of the day, you can always estimate. So if we're able to get access to the building's distribution board, we normally say to install a charging station is anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000. Mm-hmm. And so that gives you a guide. And then if you have a really old building and all of your cables are falling apart and you don't have any electricity in the building anyway, it starts getting much more expensive. But if you take as a guide, I just want to install one charging station, it's around $1,500 to $2,000, depending on how far cables we have to run and stuff like that.
And the first model you presented, Tim, the one where you need to connect to existing distribution board of power and lighting and you support the first few.
Yeah.
Is there any way that people could check that themselves, or would a licensed electrician need to be able to check that for them, or is there anything that they could do to say, you know what, we're going to be okay, or how do they get that information? Yeah,
so I never recommend anybody just open distribution boards yourself. Please get an electrician to do it. If you want to get something done straight away, what you can do is you can contact your maintenance electrician in your building. You can find the distribution board, you can take a photo of it, and you can send it to us, and we can tell you immediately what's possible and what's not. And if it's easy for you to do so, you can even tell us the distance between the distribution board and your car park, and we can probably give you an estimate of how much it would cost to install on the spot.
Right, that's great. And finally, I think the load management system that, Brent, you introduced and Tim, you sort of expanded on, sounds like, I don't think our listeners, our audience is going to, a lot of you might not know about that this capability exists, and it really is a game changer because it allows that load that an EV is going to draw to be balanced across the whole night or the whole afternoon. But Tim or Brent, what do you think the estimated cost of a load management system is? Is it an expensive piece of equipment, or is it something that's pretty affordable?
Oh, it's extremely affordable. Certainly ours is. You can buy really, really expensive ones that are supposed to cater for whole of building and lots of different things, not just EV charging. Mm-hmm. We've developed ours in-house from the ground up just for EV charging. Wow. And it's extremely affordable. We're talking less than $2,000 a year. So, really cheap.
The real cost is in the cable trays, getting that infrastructure and new distribution boards, or in maybe the 17% of instances where it's an older strata block and you might have to get a new grid connection.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to our final speaker for the evening before we open it up to general questions. And I'd like to introduce Mark Melocco. Mark's a long-time apartment owner, EV enthusiast, member of the Strata's Owners Committee, and has passed a plug-in electric vehicle bylaw to better manage and control future EV adoption in his building. Mark continues to look at ways residents can be better prepared for changes to technology, and it's his intention to further explore electrical load capacity and smart EV charging metering in the future. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Andrew.
And I'm interested in what sort of started your interest in EV charging?
I've been a car enthusiast my entire life. Not your average car enthusiast. It's been the engineering behind, the problem solving behind making cars, not just a V8 is better sort of car enthusiast.
No, a Tesla's better.
Well, they are. There is now a substitute for cubic inches. It's called electric torque. But anyway, I've been promised an electric vehicle and been thinking about electric vehicle for a very long time. I was promised one by Mercedes-Benz in 1997 when I bought a Mercedes A-Class. They said they made that car specifically because it had a sandwich system where you could fit batteries to the car, and that my next car would probably be an electric version of that. Well, they made about 4 car A-Classes they call the NECAR 4 as tests, but that's as far as it went. And pretty much every other company, except for Tesla and a few others, are very good at producing press releases on electric cars, but not actually bringing them out. But in 2006, I clicked a link on a website, and it took me to a story about a company in California that was starting to make electric cars, and that was Tesla. At the time, there were a number of manufacturers there. There was Coda, Fisker, Aperta. They all went bust. But you could tell already at the time that Tesla was something different. They talked about changing how we drive and how electric vehicles were better than internal combustion engine vehicles. All of the other manufacturers talked about what compromises we had to make to drive electric vehicles. But I think I'm probably preaching to the converted here. I've been an apartment dweller for 25 years, and being in an apartment kind of rubs up against being a car enthusiast. So when I clicked on that link to the Tesla website and learnt all about it and read Elon's little speech, I decided, well, if I'm going to drive an electric car, I have to do something about this. So I thought, well, the charging has to come first, because when I started thinking about this in about 2008, there was no such thing. There was no public charging. There might have been test public charging in America and Europe. There was nothing in Australia. Everything that I was designing was based on charging almost entirely from my house. So basically, my first action was to join the Owners Committee. If you want to, it's nice to hear that there are committees looking at this webcast, but there would also be the case where somebody's pretty much on their own, they're facing a committee that isn't very interested, doesn't want to be bothered with this newfangled thing called electric cars, and my example is probably an example of what you could do in a worst-case scenario. I would never advise you to say that my system is better than, in particular, Tim's. If you can get your owners' corporation involved and go in that direction, you are much better off. But in 2008, those things didn't exist. So I didn't pitch to the owners' corporation immediately. I got on the committee and I made myself useful. I'm in the IT business, and we have a security system that kept breaking, and I kept fixing it. So I became useful and joined the committee and sounded them out privately before I even started talking about the potential to install an EV charger. So I actually pitched to the committee in 2009, having talked to them all individually, that EVs are inevitable and the committee needs to control the installation. So the decisions really are already made for you. Eventually electric cars will come and you can either be ready for it or you can basically find people installing things, running extension cords across driveways. We have near our electrical room is our wash bay, and I'd hate to see an electric extension cord run across that. That would be a disaster. So we agreed to design a plug-in vehicle process. And, I agreed to design a plug-in vehicle process. If you don't take on the ownership of this, then a committee is not going to do it for you. So what we did first is we developed or documented the concerns of the committee, and in my particular instance, it was the capacity of the building's electrical infrastructure. And it was really nice to hear Tim's answers, because that is number one. Even just installing one potential charger in 2009 caused real concern for the committee, and I solved it in a different way, which I'll come to in a minute. But that was absolutely number one. Unauthorised charging installations, they did, to some degree, you own your parking space and you can do, subject to bylaws, anything you like in it. And that might, they thought, include installing a charge point. And they wanted something specifically saying that you don't do that without the committee's approval. They were concerned about electricity theft. As Brent says, nobody likes to pay for everybody else's electricity. And they wanted to prevent inconvenience and maintain safety. So, like the picture shows in this slide, they didn't want people trying to string cables down from their windows and plug their cars in. Now, we had an individual issue. My building is in Macleay Street, Potts Point, and the building directly next door to that, across the little aisle, is a building called Macleay Regis. It's probably the most prestigious building in Macleay Street, and it houses movie stars, lawyers, ex-politicians, some quite wealthy people, and many of them actually sublet the spaces in our building because we're right next door and very convenient. And it has been a constant struggle of our building to know who parks in our garage. Owners and tenants in our building sublet their spaces, and it's allowed, but they're not entirely happy about it. So they wanted to prioritise the access to owner residents over tenants and what I call external parking tenants, which are the Macleay Regis people of this world. And so that was an important thing that they wanted addressed. So these were the bylaws that we came up with. They were, you've got to remember, they're quite old now. They were developed in 2010, and at the annual general meeting in about November of that year, they were approved. Or was it 2011? I have to check my notes. Anyway, a long time ago. So number one, an owner or occupant of a lot must not charge a plug-in vehicle from any power source in the building except with the prior written approval of the owner's corporation. So that controls electric vehicle charging in the building. The owner of a lot will submit a design for the installation of a plug-in vehicle charging system to the body corporate and gain their written approval before commencing installation. So they want to know the capacity that you've allowed yourself to charge for, how it's going to work, whether you've measured the capacity of the building, whether there's sufficient capacity for it, because, as again, that's number one. Now, I put in number 3 and number 4 because I wanted some guidelines that I could work around because I was going to be the first person to apply for this. So before being considered for approval, the design of plug-in vehicle charging installation must meet the minimum specifications set out in 4. So a dedicated separately metered power supply, and I'll come back to this because this was actually key in my case. The dedicated power meter will be located in the electric room. That's just a housekeeping thing. The maximum capacity provided to the plug-in vehicle will be a single-phase 240 volts and 32 amps. So we're limiting the size. So if you have a fancy Tesla owner and you want 22 kilowatt charging, you're not getting it, but you don't need it either. Suitable conduit will carry the power from the plug-in vehicle to the allocated parking space of the owner's lot. So that's talking about, they were concerned, there are 34 parking spaces in our building, and they were concerned about 34 grey conduits coming out from the electrical room to each individual parking space. So if somebody wanted to do it, they had to contribute to the cable tray system in our building so that we could build on that, which kind of puts a bit of an emphasis on the first people to install stuff, but I think that's fair enough. Number 5 is more housekeeping. Again, they were concerned about extension cords and somebody's cables running into somebody else's parking space. So we created that bylaw for that specifically. And number 6, if you can understand number 6, can you tell me? Because number 6 was designed around that concern that the external parking tenants, who are wealthy people, would be the first to get electric cars and would be the first to ask, and would take up all the used capacity before other owners and residents who actually live in the building got access to it. So that's what that was. I wrote something else and it went off to a lawyer and it came up like that, and so good luck. So that's what that was about. So this is a picture of my basement. It was pretty easy to measure the number of amps coming into the building. I don't know if you can see it very well, but that little red dot on the left-hand side, that says 200A. So it's a 200 amp service. So even somebody like me could actually read that. And then there's our, yes, wooden distribution board on the back wall with the three rings of, what are they, the 3 circuits, the 3 phases, that's the word I'm after. So I knew that we had 3-phase 200 amp. And on the left are the all 1981 dial meters on the wall, and on the right-hand side is my installation, the smart meter that has been installed separately, and hopefully one day will be expanded to be the EV charging system. So the third picture on the right, you can hardly see it, but there is a cable tray crossing left to right. That's the cable tray that brings in our 200 amp service from the street. So I used that to bring it out of the electrical room, and I installed the additional cable tray that runs up to the right, that takes it to my parking space, which is behind where that picture was taken from. And it ends above my space, and then just a grey conduit down to the charger you can see there. So fairly simple. People like to know how much all this cost. Hear a lot of noise about cable trays cost a lot of money. In my bill, it specified $300 for the cable trays. Now, that doesn't include some of the labour, so it might have been a bit more than that. And that's about a 6 metre, so maybe if you count on $100 a metre for cable trays, that might be a good thing. And my entire installation, which happened in early 2011, was $3,500. So that was an early adopter who didn't think he was going to buy a Tesla but ended up with one anyway, mainly because it took so long. I started saving for one in 2006, and by 2012, nobody else really had something that had enough range. So I had enough saved to put a big deposit on a Model S, and that's the reason I ended up with it. So the lessons learned. It takes a very long time, but you knew that. 2.5 years in my case. And I was surprised. I really thought I'd get a lot more feedback from the committee. It might have been because I got onto the committee early. I made my face known. I wasn't just an external person sending a letter to the committee saying, you need to give me somewhere to charge my car. I became part of the process. I designed the process, and I think that's a major reason that I was successful. They responded well to the message that plugins are inevitable. I might have been a bit ahead of myself in 2009, but I think now you can see the number coming into Australia, the new models are, I don't know how many have been released, maybe 20 models this year, and there's only going to be more. Eventually the world is going to legislate electric vehicles, and whether Australia legislates electric vehicles or not, they'll be forced upon us. So this is now completely inevitable, certainly more than it was in 2009. I can't emphasise enough how requiring a new service in this situation, again, it is a compromise situation, was part of the reason for the success, because when you hire an electrician to install a new service into a building, they have to measure the existing capacity and do their calculations, which they wouldn't give me, and say that this additional capacity could be supported by the existing infrastructure. So that was another big concern resolved by that measure. So if you can't follow Tim and Brent's systems and your backs against the wall sort of thing, this is the only way to go. Eventually, a combined system will be required once we get to 3 or 4 or 5 cars. And what I didn't think of at the time was an exit bylaw. Luckily, in my case, my body corporate's got me. I'm quite happy to exit into a combined system. But if I was on the committee and I was being approached by somebody wanting to install something like this, I think I would write an exit bylaw. So that could be something like, we give you a license to do this for 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, the committee will decide whether we're going to introduce our own charging system, in which case you'll have to disassemble yours and join our charging system. A bylaw that says something like that. And back to bylaws, using existing procedures like bylaws was also instilled confidence. It allowed the committee to be involved. I wrote the bylaws, but as you can see, the committee added their own. They went off to legal, and they were involved in the process, and that enabled their commitment, if you want for a better word, to the process, and that's what got us through. Another thing, I'm not an electrician, and I specified 32 amps for my new supply, not understanding what a continuous load was. So I'm not getting 32 amps. But that's okay, because even 16 amps is enough to charge when you're charging overnight. I have a time of use rate. It starts at 10 o'clock, and generally, as long as I haven't left it for a week or so, it's finished by 7 o'clock when the low rate's finished. So 16 amps is more than enough. Possibly even 10 amps might be enough, but you'd have to charge more frequently in that case. So what we're looking at now, and even if I wasn't invited on this panel, I would have been with you guys watching through the webinar, is to officially determine the spare capacity in the building, and I'll probably be going to Brent to do that. Who will be the owner of the EV power supply? My building has some other issues at the moment. We've got a waterproofing slab above the car park, and we have to remove the entire garden. Won't go into that too much. They're a bit focused on that, so it's hard to get their attention on this, and I'm charging successfully, and we've only really had one inquiry, and that was a tenant with another Tesla, and he was gone before we could even answer his question. So that's the only inquiry we've had so far. I've been talking about charging points in visitors' car parks as well, but apparently that doesn't appear to be legal in my council area, but I haven't gone into it much. And also almost certainly will need council approval. And the final one will be whether we use Tim's system. There are other competing systems, which system to use. So that was my experience. It is possible. Don't give up. But it's not just a letter to your committee that will get you across the line. You need to completely involve yourself in the building and the committee itself, and get yourself known, and then approach the committee almost internally, really is the only way to do this. Anyway, that's really my story, and thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. That was some really interesting information, and great to see those bylaws. I think they're still hugely relevant
I think
to
some
a lot
of them,
the people out there.
And if anybody wants a copy of those,
we'll include
you have
them on the presentation. So I should mention again that the presentations will be available to all participants through a link, and they can also watch a copy and another copy of if there's anything they want to go back to and reference. In addition, we'll be making a summary 2-3 minute video available on our council websites where we can. So we've had a few questions, and I guess this one has come in for you, Mark, but I'm happy to open up to anyone on the panel. We've had, it's really sparked this charging and parking in Strata, I guess, is a hot button issue, but we know we've had a question from Glenn in Bondi, and he asked, in our building, the Strata committee has actually discussed banning electric vehicles stations because of the cost, and that the first couple of users will set a precedent and eventually require the building to upgrade its electrical system. So they say, let's ban it for everyone. The question is it legal, and can they pass a bylaw to disallow electric vehicle charging stations even if it's paid for by individual owners?
Wow, I'm not sure if it's legal. Basically, I think that's a very silly idea. How you would do that? First of all, do what I did. Be on the committee if you're not already. Find information. Contact Tim and Brent. Bring the information along. What you're facing there is fear. Fear of the unknown. And as you saw in my situation, the number one concern was overwhelming the electrical service. So knowing that there are now things out there that Tim and other companies provide, and what block can provide an audit of your existing use, you may find suddenly that there is capacity, or there's only enough capacity for this, and that's what electric vehicle owners will have to live with. But it's education, I think, would be the key. So get on the committee and educate them. That's all you can do.
I'll just jump in. That's a great response there, Mark. One thing, about is it legal to ban? Well, in New South Wales, the Berejiklian government actually went to the election with an election promise to reduce the threshold for allowing things that are environmental, such as, solar, batteries, electric vehicle charging in Strata, with only an ordinary resolution, as opposed to what is required today, which is a special resolution. And basically, this will lower the threshold in New South Wales. It's also been done in Western Australia, and we would expect other states to copy, which means if someone tried to ban it, you now only have to meet this 50% threshold of people who are entitled to vote, paid up on their strata levies to be in favour of having electric vehicle charging.
To support it.
Can I tell you, if your owners corp wants to ban electric cars, move out. Seriously. You don't want to be in that building. Move out. Because they're only shooting themselves in the foot because they're reducing their own property values. And why do you want to be in that building? You don't want to be in that building. Go somewhere else.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Some great answers there. I've got a few burning issues to get through, and there's only about 5 minutes. So if we can give really quick, succinct responses, we can get through about 8 questions. So the first one is for you, Tim.
Yep.
Would the money be reimbursed by the owners' corporation, by the billing agent? Would it be viewed as income for the owners' corporation?
If you put a margin on the electricity, yeah, probably.
Mm-hmm. But otherwise, it's just cost recovery.
Do a cost recovery bill.
Okay, and the next question is about renters in EVs. How do they get around this whole EV problems? The properties managers don't bother replying to questions about charges. They're not going to be there for very long. Maybe how do they overcome a situation where they might be in and out in a year or 2 years?
So go for newer apartments. Go for ones with visitor car parks that have charging already installed. And if you're going to be in a building for a couple of years, for example, you can get a rental charger product from JetCharge, so you can contact us if you want.
Great. The next question, I think I can answer this. Will the technology remain future-proof, or will it need to change? Essentially, an EV charger is a glorified PowerPoint. If you plug it in, it's going to do the job and it's going to charge at that rate. And what are the warranties on the EV chargers?
Anywhere from 2 to 3 years, but you can get longer warranties if you want. And I always say, think of EV charging stations more like electricity meters than think of them like phones. Charging stations are not like mobile phones. They're more like power points and meters.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Can an EV charger be installed in an individual lot car park being on-sold with the apartment when it's sold? This could have potential to be an advantageous selling point for an apartment and justify a higher selling price.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Of course you can.
Yep. That's a great idea.
Yep.
Okay. A couple more. My building, this is from Tim Broadbent. My building has mostly open air car spots. Around half aren't even alongside the building. Are there existing products for our building, or would we need expensive custom weatherproof infrastructure to be installed?
So if you don't have a post or a wall or anything to mount it to, there are ceiling mount options, but they do tend to be more expensive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Can we use solar from the roof of the RFB for use in the EV rather than coal-generated electricity? I don't know some of the terminology, but can you use solar?
Yeah, in fact, we've got a really interesting use case already up in Sanctuary Cove. We help them install solar panels, and those solar panels are used to recharge 92 electric golf buggies.
And you can now, even if you wanted to do this, you can actually calculate the amount of solar that you're generating and output exactly that to charge the vehicle. So you can always say to the contrarians that you're charging your cars purely from solar.
Okay.
Yep.
That's great. Here's a specific question from Rob. The power points in each lot owner's garage are currently not connected to the lot owner's power, but that of the owner's corporation, which means EV charging, even from the most basic level, will need to be a cost of the OC, not the lot owner. Any tips on how to deal with this? So I think, do you just want to explain how that works with the billing system and individual charges, Tim?
Yeah, so basically, if you have a power point in your parking spot, any power that you use, the owner's corporation will pay for, and that includes charging. The only way to stop that is to install a charging station that can be monitored, or you have to put monitoring devices on all power points.
Okay. And we're going to have time for two more. Are there any New South Wales government incentives to introduce regulations on EVs in the strata arena?
Not incentives, but as I said, think of the move to an ordinary resolution from what it is currently today, special resolution for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Think of that as an unblocker for committees that might be a little bit adverse to the idea.
And if you know any people on a council, or if you know any council staff member, you can always say to them the City of Adelaide provides a subsidy for the installation of charging stations. So
okay.
Get them up there, no?
There's a high benchmark in Adelaide. And a final question to sort of finish off before we wrap up. Can you clarify how a non-car owner can ensure that they are not being charged via levies for car owners' electricity use for EV charging? So how does the non-EV owner know that things all stack up and there's transparency?
Yeah, look, if you go to Tim and get a fully metered solution, then you've got an audit trail. So what you can't measure, you can't quantify, you can't be accountable for.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's good advice. So, before we wrap up, any final words? We'll start with you, Mark. Just a final comment on the key message, if you had to summarise.
Well, my key message is join your committee, make yourself known, and do the work. Don't expect the committee to do it for you. Also wanted to sort of just say, somebody mentioned something about redundancy. Fortunately, the Motor Traders Association, I think recently, it's not the Australian government, regulated or suggested that all manufacturers now use the same charging plug. So Tim knows what that is, and it's called a Type 2 plug. So if your charging infrastructure that you put in, whatever design it is, has a Type 2 plug at the end of it. That's the most future-proof one that you can put in. And even for people who bought older cars that use a different plug, mainly the earlier Japanese models, there are adapters that Tim sells also for those as well. So if you're worried about future-proofing it, make sure you stick to that standard.
Tim, final message?
So within the next 5 years, we're going to start selling 100,000 EVs a year in this country. 50,000 of those will be in New South Wales. The vast majority of them will be in Sydney Metro. So if you're in a building or you're on an owner's corp or you manage a strata, this is going to come up. And your choice is, do you facilitate people with, high net worth buying these cars to be in your building, or do you kick them out? Because if you don't let them do it and you don't have basically a system for doing it, they're going to move somewhere else. So I'd encourage you to start the process now.
Great.
Okay, and look, I'd suggest an EV survey is a great way to just get a measure of the intent of the people inside your strata building. And we've got 53% of respondents saying that they're going to be buying an electric vehicle in the next 10 years.
Great. Thank you, guys. Big thank you to Brent Clark from Watt Block, Tim Washington from Jet Charge, and Mark Melocco. And thank you all for listening. A big thank you also to Jordan Moy from North Sydney Council for organising the webinar today, and an excellent job. Thank you, and we'll be in communication with all the resources, and hope this has really been a good chance to stimulate some conversation and discussion and thoughts about EV charging in your apartment block.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you. Good night.